Sarah Martinez had been serving in the 47th Intelligence Unit for 3 years when everything changed on that cold Tuesday morning in November. The concrete floor of the training facility was unforgiving, and the sound of her head hitting it echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. What should have been a routine combat training exercise became the catalyst for exposing one of the most shocking cover-ups in military history. The day started like any other at Fort Davidson. Sarah arrived at 0500 hours, her boots clicking against the polished hallway floors as she made her way to the briefing room. She was known among her peers as someone who never backed down from a challenge, whether it was decoding encrypted enemy communications or facing down an opponent twice her size in hand-to-hand combat training. Her reputation for thoroughness had earned her the respect of her commanding officers and the friendship of her fellow intelligence analysts. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was leading the training session that morning. He was a 20-year veteran with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could be heard across 3 buildings. Sarah had sparred with him dozens of times before, and she knew his moves almost as well as her own. But something was different about Rodriguez that day. His usual professional demeanor was replaced by an aggression that seemed personal, almost vindictive. The other members of the unit gathered around the mat, watching as Sarah and Rodriguez circled each other. Lieutenant James Foster, the newest member of their team, stood at the edge of the group with his arms crossed. He had been asking too many questions lately about their current operations, questions that made Sarah uncomfortable. There was something about the way he watched their classified briefings, taking notes that seemed to go beyond what was necessary for someone in his position. The sparring match began normally enough. Sarah and Rodriguez exchanged a series of controlled strikes and blocks, each testing the other's defenses. But as the minutes passed, Rodriguez's attacks became more aggressive, more focused on causing actual harm rather than demonstrating technique. Sarah found herself on the defensive, backing away from strikes that came dangerously close to connecting with full force. It was during one of these exchanges that Sarah noticed something that would later prove to be crucial. As Rodriguez threw a particularly vicious combination, she caught a glimpse of a folder on the nearby equipment table. The folder was marked with classification levels she had never seen before, and the partial heading she could make out read, Operation Silent Thunder. The momentary distraction was all Rodriguez needed. His boot connected with the side of her head with a sickening thud. Sarah felt her vision blur as she hit the concrete floor, her skull bouncing once before coming to rest. The gymnasium fell silent except for the ringing in her ears. As consciousness faded in and out, she heard voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones above her. When Sarah finally regained full consciousness in the base medical facility 2 hours later, she found herself staring at the concerned face of Dr. Patricia Williamson, the chief medical officer. The doctor's expression was professional, but Sarah could see worry in her eyes that went beyond normal medical concern. "How are you feeling, Sergeant Martinez?" Dr. Williamson asked, shining a small flashlight into Sarah's eyes to check her pupil response. Sarah tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down onto the examination table. "Like I got hit by a truck," she managed to say. "What happened to me out there?" Dr. Williamson hesitated for a moment before responding. "You suffered a significant concussion during training. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez says it was an accident, but..." She trailed off, glancing toward the closed door of the examination room. "But what?" Sarah pressed, sensing there was more to the story. The doctor moved closer and lowered her voice. "The impact pattern doesn't match what you'd expect from an accidental strike during sparring. It looks more like you were kicked while you were already falling or down." She paused, clearly struggling with whether to say more. "Sarah, I've been treating military personnel for 15 years, and I know the difference between training accidents and something else." Before Sarah could respond, the examination room door opened, and Lieutenant Foster walked in. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, and Dr. Williamson stepped back, her expression becoming neutral and professional again. "Sergeant Martinez," Foster said with what appeared to be genuine concern, "I'm glad to see you're awake. We were all worried about you." His words were appropriate, but something in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the pounding in her head. "I'm sure I'll be fine in a few days," Foster nodded, but his eyes were studying her face intently, as if he were trying to gauge how much she remembered about the incident. "Take all the time you need to recover. Your health is our top priority." He turned to Dr. Williamson. "Doctor, I'd like a word with you outside when you're finished here." After Foster left the room, Dr. Williamson completed her examination in silence. When she was done, she handed Sarah a prescription bottle and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Take these for the pain, but more importantly, be careful who you trust. Sometimes accidents aren't accidents." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the doctor was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a growing sense that the kick to her head was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. That evening, as Sarah lay in her barracks bunk trying to make sense of what had happened, she couldn't stop thinking about the folder she had glimpsed during the sparring match. Operation Silent Thunder. The name meant nothing to her, but the level of classification suggested it was something significant. Her unit dealt with intelligence analysis, but their clearance levels shouldn't have given them access to anything marked with the symbols she had seen. The next morning brought new questions and deeper concerns. When Sarah reported for duty, she found that her access credentials to several databases had been mysteriously revoked overnight. When she asked her immediate supervisor, Captain Jennifer Hayes, about the changes, she was told it was routine maintenance and that her access would be restored soon. But Sarah had been in the intelligence field long enough to know that there was nothing routine about having your security clearances altered without prior notice. Throughout the day, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how her colleagues interacted with her. Conversations would stop when she approached, and people who had always been friendly now seemed distant and cautious. Most troubling was the way Lieutenant Foster seemed to be watching her every move. Whenever she looked up from her workstation, she could feel his eyes on her, and when she would turn to look directly at him, he would quickly look away or pretend to be engrossed in his own work. It was during her lunch break that Sarah decided to do some investigating of her own. Using her remaining database access, she began searching for any reference to Operation Silent Thunder. What she found made her blood run cold. There were fragments of reports, partial communications, and budget allocations that painted a picture of a covert operation that went far beyond anything their unit should have been involved in. The fragments suggested that Operation Silent Thunder involved the illegal surveillance of American citizens, including members of Congress and federal judges. The operation appeared to be using military intelligence resources to gather information for political purposes, a clear violation of federal law and military regulations. Even more disturbing was the indication that the operation had been running for over 2 years, with multiple military units unknowingly providing support. As Sarah dug deeper into the available information, she realized why Lieutenant Foster had been so interested in their unit's activities. He wasn't just gathering intelligence about their operations. He was monitoring them to ensure they didn't discover what was really going on. The 47th Intelligence Unit had been used as an unwitting cover for Operation Silent Thunder, and now someone was worried that Sarah might have seen too much. The pieces were starting to come together, but Sarah knew she needed more concrete evidence before she could take her concerns to anyone. The problem was that every search she conducted could be traced back to her user credentials, and she was certain that someone was monitoring her activities. She needed to find another way to gather information, and she needed to be very careful about who she trusted. That night, as Sarah walked across the base toward her barracks, she noticed a black sedan parked in an unusual location near the administration building. The vehicle had government plates, but it wasn't one of the standard base vehicles. As she watched from a distance, she saw 3 figures emerge from the building and get into the car. Even in the darkness, she could make out the distinctive silhouettes of high-ranking military officers, their uniform insignia catching the light from the nearby street lamps. The sedan drove slowly past Sarah's location, and she got a clear look at the men inside. She recognized one of them immediately. General Richard Morrison, the commanding officer of the entire military district. She had seen his photo countless times in briefings and official publications, but she had never expected to see him at Fort Davidson, especially not at this hour. The other 2 men were also clearly high-ranking officers, though she couldn't identify them from a distance. As the sedan disappeared into the night, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. The presence of such senior officers at their small intelligence facility could only mean one thing. Whatever was happening with Operation Silent Thunder was significant enough to warrant attention at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. Sarah spent the rest of the night lying awake in her bunk, trying to process everything she had discovered. The kick to her head during training now seemed like much more than an accident. It was beginning to look like an attempt to silence her before she could uncover the truth about what their unit had been unknowingly supporting. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The next morning brought an announcement that would change everything for the 47th Intelligence Unit. Captain Hayes called an emergency meeting for all personnel, her face grave as she delivered news that no one had expected. But before she could reveal what the three generals had decided during their midnight visit to Fort Davidson, Sarah knew that her life, and the lives of everyone in her unit, were about to be turned upside down. The kick to her head had started a chain of events that would expose corruption at the highest levels of the military command structure. What Sarah didn't know was that she was about to become the key witness in a case that would make headlines around the world and forever change how military intelligence operations were conducted. The three generals thought they could contain the situation by closing the unit, but they had underestimated the determination of one sergeant who refused to let the truth be buried. Captain Hayes stood at the front of the briefing room, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and uncertainty. The entire 47th Intelligence Unit had been assembled on short notice, with personnel pulled from ongoing assignments and called in from leave. Sarah sat in the back row, still dealing with lingering headaches from her concussion, but alert enough to notice the tension in the room was unlike anything she had experienced in her 3 years with the unit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes began, her voice lacking its usual authority, "I've received orders from the highest levels of command regarding the immediate future of our unit." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the 23 men and women who had dedicated their careers to intelligence, analysis, and national security. Lieutenant Foster sat in the front row, and Sarah noticed that he seemed less surprised by the announcement than everyone else. His reaction, or lack thereof, confirmed her growing suspicions about his true role within their unit. While other personnel shifted uncomfortably in their seats and exchanged worried glances, Foster sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. "Effective immediately," Hayes continued. "The 47th Intelligence Unit is being disbanded. All personnel will be reassigned to other units within the next 72 hours. All current projects are to be terminated, and all classified materials are to be secured and transferred to a special collection team that will arrive this afternoon." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and questions, but Hayes raised her hand for silence. "I know this comes as a shock, and I wish I could provide you with more details about the reasoning behind this decision. What I can tell you is that this order came directly from a joint command comprising General Morrison, General Patricia Vance from Intelligence Command, and General Robert Kim from Internal Affairs." Sarah felt her stomach drop at the confirmation that 3 of the military's most senior officers had been involved in the decision to close their unit. The presence of a general from Internal Affairs was particularly concerning, as it suggested that their unit was under investigation for some type of misconduct or security breach. After the briefing, Sarah lingered in the hallway outside the conference room, hoping to overhear conversations that might provide more insight into what was happening. She watched as her colleagues dispersed, some heading to their workstations to begin the process of securing classified materials, others gathering in small groups to discuss the shocking news. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from the briefing room and walked directly toward Sarah. She tensed, remembering the violent training session that had started this entire chain of events. But instead of the aggressive demeanor he had displayed during their sparring match, Rodriguez appeared nervous and apologetic. "Martinez," he said quietly, looking around to ensure they weren't being overheard, "I need to talk to you about what happened during training the other day." Sarah studied his face, trying to determine his intentions. "What about it, Sergeant?" Rodriguez moved closer, lowering his voice even further. "It wasn't an accident. I was ordered to make sure you were incapacitated for a few days. I was told it was for your own protection, that you had stumbled onto something dangerous and needed time away from the investigation you were conducting. What investigation? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The database searches you were running. Someone noticed that you were accessing files related to Operation Silent Thunder. Rodriguez's hands were shaking slightly as he spoke. Shana, I was told that if I didn't find a way to keep you away from those files for a few days, something much worse would happen to you. Sarah felt a mix of anger and validation. Her suspicions about the training incident had been correct. But learning that Rodriguez had been coerced into attacking her raised new questions about who was really behind the operation. Who gave you those orders? Rodriguez glanced around nervously. Lieutenant Foster. But he made it clear that he was acting on behalf of much higher authority. He said that if I didn't cooperate, both of us would end up in military prison for treason. Before Sarah could respond, Foster himself appeared at the end of the hallway. Rodriguez immediately fell silent and walked quickly in the opposite direction, leaving Sarah standing alone as Foster approached. Sergeant Martinez, Foster said with his characteristic false warmth. How are you feeling? I hope you're recovering well from your training accident. Just fine, sir, Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the rage building inside her. Excellent. I wanted to let you know that your reassignment has been expedited. You'll be transferring to the 15th Intelligence Battalion at Fort Marshall by the end of the week. It's actually a promotion opportunity. You'll be working directly with senior analysts on some very important projects. Sarah recognized the offer for what it was, an attempt to isolate her from anyone who might corroborate her suspicions about Operation Silent Thunder. Fort Marshall was 3 states away, and the 15th Intelligence Battalion dealt primarily with overseas intelligence rather than domestic operations. That's very generous, sir. But I'd prefer to remain in this geographical area if possible. I have family commitments that would make relocation difficult. Foster's smile became strained. I'm afraid this particular assignment is non-negotiable, Sergeant. The orders have already been cut, and the transfer paperwork has been filed. You report to Fort Marshall on Monday morning. That afternoon, Sarah watched as the special collection team arrived to secure all classified materials from the unit. The team consisted of 6 individuals in civilian clothes who worked with military precision to identify, catalog, and remove every piece of classified information from the facility. What struck Sarah as unusual was that they seemed to know exactly what they were looking for, as if they had detailed inventories of what should be present in each office and workstation. Dr. Williamson appeared at Sarah's side as they both watched the collection team work. Quite a thorough operation, the doctor observed quietly. Too thorough, Sarah replied. It's like they know exactly what evidence they need to collect. Dr. Williamson nodded. I've been thinking about our conversation after your injury. I've done some checking on my own, and I've discovered some things that I think you should know. She glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed. Meet me in the base chapel tonight at 2100 hours. It's the only place on base that isn't under electronic surveillance. That evening, Sarah made her way to the base chapel, a small building that served the spiritual needs of personnel from various religious backgrounds. Dr. Williamson was already there, sitting in one of the back pews with a folder in her lap. I've been the chief medical officer here for 8 years, Dr. Williamson began without preamble. And I've never seen anything like what's been happening over the past 6 months. There have been too many training accidents, too many personnel transfers, and too many security clearance modifications. She opened the folder and showed Sarah a series of medical reports. These are injury reports from personnel in 6 different intelligence units across 3 military districts. All of the injuries occurred during routine training, and all of the injured personnel had been conducting unauthorized database searches in the weeks before their accidents. Sarah studied the reports, noting the patterns that Dr. Williamson had identified. How did you get access to medical records from other bases? Professional medical networks. Doctors talk to each other, especially when they start seeing patterns that don't make sense. Dr. Williamson pulled out another set of documents. But this is what really concerns me. These are transfer orders for all the personnel who were injured. Every single one of them was reassigned to isolated positions where they would have minimal contact with their previous colleagues and limited access to intelligence databases. The scope of what Dr. Williamson was showing her was staggering. Operation Silent Thunder wasn't just affecting their unit. It appeared to be a systematic effort to identify and neutralize anyone who might stumble upon evidence of the illegal surveillance program. There's more, Dr. Williamson continued. I reached out to some colleagues at other bases, and several intelligence units have been disbanded over the past year under various pretexts. Personnel are scattered to different assignments, classified materials are collected by special teams, and within weeks, it's as if these units never existed. Sarah felt the full weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. Doctor, what you're showing me suggests a conspiracy that goes far beyond anything I imagined. If Operation Silent Thunder is big enough to require the elimination of entire military units, then the people behind it have resources and authority at the highest levels of the military command structure. Dr. Williamson nodded gravely. Which brings us to the question of what we're going to do about it. Your transfer to Fort Marshall is scheduled for Monday, but I don't think you'll be safe there. If they've gone to these lengths to cover up whatever Operation Silent Thunder involves, they won't hesitate to arrange for more serious accidents if they think you pose a continuing threat. Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the chapel. Dr. Williamson quickly gathered the documents and stuffed them back into the folder. Take this, she whispered, pressing a small electronic device into Sarah's hand. It's a secure communication device. If you need to contact me after your transfer, use this. Be very careful who you trust. The chapel door opened, and Lieutenant Foster entered, accompanied by 2 military police officers. Sarah's heart began racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. Sergeant Martinez, Dr. Williamson, Foster said, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. Working late this evening? Just seeking some spiritual guidance during this difficult transition, Sarah replied, standing up from the pew. The disbanding of our unit has been quite stressful for all of us. Foster studied both women for a moment before nodding. Of course, these are challenging times. Dr. Williamson, I believe you have some medical paperwork that needs to be completed regarding Sergeant Martinez's fitness for transfer? Already completed and filed, Dr. Williamson replied smoothly. Sergeant Martinez is cleared for full duty and assignment transfer. After Foster and the military police left the chapel, Sarah and Dr. Williamson waited several minutes before speaking again. When they finally felt safe, Dr. Williamson grabbed Sarah's arm. They're watching us more closely than I thought, she said urgently. Your transfer to Fort Marshall isn't just about getting you away from here. I think they're planning something more permanent to ensure your silence. Sarah looked down at the communication device in her hand. Then I guess I'd better find a way to get this information to someone who can do something about it before Monday. There's someone I think you should meet, Dr. Williamson said. A journalist who specializes in military investigations. She's been asking questions about some of the same patterns I've been noticing. Her name is Rebecca Chen, and she works for a national magazine that has a reputation for exposing government corruption. As they made plans for Sarah to contact the journalist, neither woman realized that their conversation in the chapel had been monitored by sophisticated listening devices that had been installed throughout the base earlier that week. In a secure facility 50 miles away, technicians were already preparing a transcript of their conversation for review by the 3 generals who had ordered the unit's closure. The next morning brought news that would accelerate everyone's timeline. Captain Hayes was found dead in her quarters, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. She was only 38 years old and had no history of cardiac problems. Her death sent shockwaves through what remained of the 47th Intelligence Unit, but it also served as a stark warning to anyone who might be considering speaking out about what they had discovered. Sarah knew that time was running out. The journalist Rebecca Chen was scheduled to meet with her that evening, but with Captain Hayes dead and her own transfer looming, she was beginning to wonder if she would live long enough to tell her story. The 3 generals had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to protect Operation Silent Thunder, and Sarah was becoming an increasingly dangerous loose end in their carefully constructed cover-up. As she prepared for what might be the most important meeting of her life, Sarah couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. A single kick to her head during a training exercise had started a chain of events that would either expose one of the most significant military scandals in modern history or result in her own mysterious disappearance. The choice was no longer hers to make. The only question was whether she could stay alive long enough to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. Rebecca Chen arrived at the designated meeting location 30 minutes early, her investigative instincts telling her to scout the area before any potential source arrived. The abandoned diner 20 miles from Fort Davidson provided the perfect cover for a clandestine meeting, isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention, but public enough to discourage any direct confrontation. She had received Dr. Williamson's encrypted message the previous evening, and the urgency in the doctor's words had convinced her to drop everything and drive through the night to reach the meeting location. Sarah approached the diner at exactly 1,900 hours. Her military training evident in her punctuality and the way she surveyed the parking lot before entering the building. She spotted Rebecca immediately, a young Asian woman with intelligent eyes and a digital recorder discreetly positioned on the table in front of her. Despite the gravity of the situation, Sarah felt a moment of relief that someone was finally willing to listen to her story. "Miss Chen?" Sarah asked as she slid into the booth across from the journalist. "Please, call me Rebecca. Dr. Williamson told me you have information about military intelligence operations that the public needs to know about." Rebecca's voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could see the excitement in her eyes at the prospect of a major story. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her story, starting with the kick to her head during training and progressing through her discovery of Operation Silent Thunder, the suspicious behavior of Lieutenant Foster, and the sudden disbanding of their unit by 3 generals. As she spoke, Rebecca took detailed notes and asked pointed questions that demonstrated her understanding of military structure and intelligence operations. "The scope of what you're describing would require coordination at the highest levels of the Pentagon," Rebecca said when Sarah finished her account. "Operation Silent Thunder, if it exists as you describe it, would be a massive violation of federal law and military regulations. The surveillance of American citizens by military intelligence is strictly prohibited, except under very specific circumstances." Sarah nodded. "That's why they're going to such lengths to cover it up. Dr. Williamson showed me evidence that this same pattern has been repeated at multiple bases across the country. Intelligence personnel who get too close to the truth are either injured in training accidents, transferred to isolated positions, or in the case of Captain Hayes." "You think she was murdered?" Rebecca interrupted, her pen hovering over her notepad. "A 38-year-old woman in perfect health doesn't just die of a heart attack the day after learning that her unit is being disbanded because of a major scandal. It's too convenient to be coincidental." Rebecca leaned back in her seat, processing the implications of what Sarah was telling her. "I need to see some documentation before I can move forward with this story. Military sources are always claiming conspiracy and cover-up, but most of the time, it turns out to be misunderstandings or routine administrative actions." Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a small data storage device. "Dr. Williamson gave me copies of medical records, transfer orders, and database access logs that show the pattern of surveillance and retaliation. She also managed to obtain fragments of communications that reference Operation Silent Thunder by name." As Rebecca examined the device, she failed to notice the black sedan that had pulled into the diner's parking lot. Inside the vehicle, 2 men in dark suits were speaking quietly into handheld radios, reporting Sarah's location to a command center that had been tracking her movements since she left Fort Davidson. "This is substantial evidence," Rebecca said, plugging the device into her laptop. "If these documents are authentic, we're looking at one of the biggest military scandals since the Pentagon Papers." She began scrolling through the files, her excitement growing with each document she reviewed. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said, glancing nervously toward the diner's windows. "My transfer to Fort Marshall isn't just about getting me away from the investigation. Dr. Williamson believes they're planning to arrange for a more permanent solution to the problem I represent." Rebecca looked up from her laptop, suddenly realizing the personal danger that Sarah was facing. "Why didn't you go to your commanding officers or military investigators with this information?" "Because the commanding officers are the ones giving the orders, and military investigators report to the same generals who are running the cover-up. The only chance of exposing this is through outside media attention that forces an independent investigation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 men in military uniforms who entered the diner and took a seat at the counter. Sarah recognized one of them immediately as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and her blood ran cold as she realized their meeting location had been compromised. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered urgently to Rebecca. Now, Rebecca quickly disconnected her laptop and gathered her materials, but it was too late. Rodriguez and his companions stood up from the counter and moved to block the diner's main exit. Through the window, Sarah could see that additional personnel had surrounded the building. "Sergeant Martinez," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying none of the nervousness she had heard when he confessed to following orders to injure her. "Lieutenant Foster would like to speak with you. Please come with us quietly." Sarah looked around the diner, searching for an alternative exit. The kitchen door was visible behind the counter, but reaching it would require getting past Rodriguez and his men. The bathroom might offer a window for escape, but she had no way of knowing whether the building was completely surrounded. "I'm a journalist," Rebecca announced, standing up and addressing Rodriguez directly. "This woman is providing information for a news story about military operations. Any attempt to detain her would constitute interference with freedom of the press." Rodriguez smiled coldly. "Ma'am, this is a matter of national security. Sergeant Martinez is carrying classified materials that she was not authorized to remove from her base. She needs to come with us for debriefing." Sarah knew that once they took her into custody, she would never have another opportunity to expose Operation Silent Thunder. The death of Captain Hayes had shown that the people behind the cover-up were willing to use lethal force to protect their secret. She made a decision that would either save her life or end it. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "when I say run, head for the kitchen door. Get out of here and publish the story no matter what happens to me." Before Rebecca could respond, Sarah suddenly stood up and shouted, "Everyone get down! There's a bomb in this building." The diner erupted in chaos as the handful of other customers screamed and ran toward the exits. In the confusion, Sarah grabbed Rebecca's arm and pulled her toward the kitchen. Rodriguez and his men were momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected panic, giving the two women a few precious seconds to reach the back of the restaurant. They burst through the kitchen door to find the cook and two waitresses huddled together in terror. Sarah spotted a rear exit and pushed Rebecca toward it. "Go. Get to your car and drive straight to the nearest FBI office. Don't stop for anything." As they emerged from the back of the diner, Sarah heard Rodriguez shouting orders to his men. She knew they had only moments before the building would be surrounded completely. Rebecca's car was parked behind the diner, and they ran toward it as fast as they could. "I'm not leaving without you," Rebecca said as she fumbled for her car keys. "You have to," Sarah replied, looking back toward the diner where Rodriguez and his men were already emerging from the kitchen door. "The story is more important than any one person. Get those documents to the FBI and make sure the world knows what's been happening." Rebecca started her car and looked back at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "What about you? I'll find another way out of this. Just go." As Rebecca's car disappeared into the darkness, Sarah found herself alone in the parking lot with nowhere to run. Rodriguez and his men approached cautiously, their hands resting on their weapons. "It's over, Martinez," Rodriguez said as he got within speaking distance. "You've caused enough trouble. Lieutenant Foster is waiting for you at a secure facility where you can be properly debriefed about the classified information you've been sharing with unauthorized personnel." Sarah knew that the secure facility Rodriguez mentioned was likely a place where inconvenient people disappeared forever, but she also knew that Rebecca was now driving toward safety with evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Even if they killed her, the truth would eventually come out. "Before you take me anywhere," Sarah said, "I think you should know that copies of all the evidence have been sent to multiple news organizations and government oversight agencies. Killing me won't stop the investigation anymore." "Everyone," Rodriguez's confident expression faltered slightly, "you're lying. We've been monitoring all your communications. Dr. Williamson set up a dead man's switch before she gave me those documents. If I don't check in with her every 12 hours, the evidence gets automatically sent to a list of recipients that includes FBI investigators, congressional oversight committees, and journalists at major news organizations." It was a complete bluff. But Sarah could see that Rodriguez wasn't certain whether to believe her. She pressed her advantage. hoping to buy time for Rebecca to reach safety. The three generals think they can control this situation, but it's already too big to contain. Operation Silent Thunder is going to be exposed whether I live or die. The only question is whether the people involved cooperate with the investigation or face charges for murder and treason. Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio, presumably reporting Sarah's claims to his superiors. After a brief conversation, he turned back to her with a grim expression. "Change of plans, Martinez. You're coming with us, but you're going to help us clean up this mess. If you cooperate fully, there might be a way to resolve this situation that doesn't end with everyone involved spending the rest of their lives in military prison." Sarah realized that her bluff had worked better than she had hoped. The mention of automatic evidence distribution had clearly worried Rodriguez's superiors enough to consider negotiation rather than elimination. She was far from safe, but at least she was still alive and potentially valuable as a cooperating witness, rather than just a security threat to be eliminated. As they drove toward Fort Davidson, Sarah wondered whether Rebecca had made it safely to the FBI, and whether the evidence they had shared would be enough to bring down Operation Silent Thunder. The kick to her head that had started this entire chain of events seemed like a lifetime ago, but she knew that the real battle was just beginning. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a federal courthouse watching as General Morrison, General Vance, and General Kim were led away in handcuffs after being convicted of conspiracy, illegal surveillance, and violation of civil rights. Rebecca Chen's investigative reporting had sparked a congressional investigation that exposed a massive domestic spying operation that had been running for over 3 years. The 47th Intelligence Unit had been officially disbanded, but its members had been reassigned to new positions with full honors after the truth came out. Dr. Williamson received a commendation for her role in exposing the conspiracy, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony against the generals who had coerced him into participating in the cover-up. As Sarah walked down the courthouse steps, Rebecca approached her with a copy of the magazine that featured their story on the cover. "Any regrets about speaking out?" Rebecca asked. Sarah looked up at the American flag flying over the federal building and smiled. "The only regret I have is that it took a kick to the head to wake me up to what was happening. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight." The scandal that became known as Operation Silent Thunder led to comprehensive reforms in military intelligence oversight and strengthened protections for whistleblowers who expose government misconduct. Sarah returned to active duty with a new assignment in the Pentagon's Inspector General Office, where she worked to prevent future abuses of military intelligence capabilities. The three generals who had thought they could control the truth discovered that some secrets are too important to stay buried, and that sometimes a single person with courage can bring down even the most powerful conspiracy. Sarah Martinez had proven that in America, no one is above the law. Not even the generals who think they are untouchable.